introduction, Gabriela, and to the organizers for giving me this opportunity to share with you some of my experiences as a computer scientist in the area called Biodiversity Informatics. I would hope that you find very relevant for this conference, being it hosted here in Costa Rica, that we talk about an activity in which a biodiversity-rich developing country like Costa Rica, which has also been very actively involved in GBIF, Encyclopedia of Life, and other biodiversity informatics initiatives, that we take this opportunity to raise the level of awareness about the importance of information and communication technologies in biodiversity conservation, which has been the main reason I have been involved for the last 20 years in this area. I have divided this presentation into five main subjects. First, a brief introduction to biodiversity conservation and what the main challenges are. Then, what is biodiversity informatics and how we can translate those biodiversity conservation challenges into challenges that we as computer scientists may understand better and may do something better to cope with those conservation challenges. A very, very quick history of biodiversity informatics is it's only about 25 years old, so there's not much to say. And then briefly mention two or three of the main initiatives. One is the Global Biodiversity Information Facility, and the other one is the Encyclopedia of Life. And I will briefly also mention a very important one for those who do data mining, called the Biodiversity Heritage Library, a huge initiative that has digitized more than 50 million pages of literature about biodiversity. And then finally, depending on how much time we have, I will also refer to the Global Biodiversity Informatics Outlook. This is the roadmap for biodiversity informatics for, I would say, the next 5 years. This is a 4-year-old document now, and it was supposed to be for the next 10 years. So we are kind of halfway along the path delineated by this document. To talk about biodiversity informatics, we have to talk about biodiversity conservation first. And our main target is scientists who generate knowledge. So what is it that they do when they do biodiversity research? Understanding is the key word here. They try to understand and explain the rich biodiversity or the rich diversity of living nature. Living nature and biodiversity are used interchangeably by me and by most people. At the genetic, species, and ecosystem level, there are 3 levels of biodiversity that have to be taken into account, as well as the relationship with geographical, meteorological, and anthropogenic variables, among others. So how can we help them? They generate data that, in its most primitive form, corresponds to what is there, where it was found, when it was found, when they take a sample from the field, how those species interact, and why, the causality. That is the big question that mainly ecologists deal with. The taxonomists deal with the first 3 questions, what, where, and when. And the ecologists deal with the interactions, the very complex interactions. And then they're not just descriptive, but they also look at the future. How can we predict how a population is going to change, for example? And of course, they depend heavily on having access to the best available data and also to appropriate software tools. That gives us some indication of where is it that we computer scientists can play a role. In order to understand the many challenges of biodiversity conservation, I always use what I call the 6 dimensions of biodiversity. And for each of those dimensions, we can identify challenges. And for each of those challenges, we can also say who are the main actors in coping with those challenges. And the first one that I always like to start with is the aesthetic dimension of biodiversity. Gabriela just mentioned that some of you already probably went, and if you didn't, you should after the conference. You probably went to enjoy some of our wild protected areas. It is, of course, nicer to go to a very beautiful national park than it is to go on a weekend to, say, a shopping mall. So the challenge of enjoying and loving that biodiversity shouldn't be that hard. It is natural. We have what Edward Wilson calls a natural biophilia, that somehow in between elementary and secondary school is a little bit lost, and we change our priorities. But we have that natural tendency of enjoying and loving nature. Now, from our own personal experience with biodiversity and even in personal relations, you know that loving it is not so easy. Loving means also being willing to sacrifice. And that's the real challenge of enjoying and loving that aesthetic dimension of biodiversity. What are we willing to do in order to demonstrate that love? And of course, it has to be done by everybody, not just by the government or the NGOs or the scientists. Then the second dimension is the huge diversity. Only about 20% of the current biodiversity we call on the planet is known. And that means about 2 million species have been described. Even those that have been described, when I say 2 million, I say approximately, because nobody knows how many have been described. It is so complex and so diverse that many species have several names, several scientific names. One given by a German guy who came to Costa Rica 100 years ago, another by an American who came to Costa Rica 20 years ago, and perhaps another one given by a Costa Rican who last week claimed this was a new species. And it was because the literature was not available to do a full research, and therefore there's something called the synonymia problem of identifying what is it that currently has different names, but represent the same thing. So we can only say that approximately 2 million species have been identified. It's so diverse and so complex to make sure that two species that have a different name really are the same thing. That's still tough. The other one is the complexity, and the challenge is how to decipher that complexity and how to model that complexity. Here's where mainly ecologists come into place. They have to understand. There's a very nice metaphor that I like about biodiversity. I heard it from Dan Jansen first. He says that every species is like a book, and that the main task we have in order to understand biodiversity is to decipher that book. That book is written in some strange language. You have to observe each of those species, sometimes for years, in order to qualify their behavior, what they eat, how they reproduce, what are the best niches where this species lives, and so on. So that biography associated with each species is the main challenge that taxonomists and biologists have. Then I also already mentioned that most of it is unknown, and we have the challenge of discovering and associate that information with previous information, and that's mainly taxonomists who do it. Sadly, another dimension is related to how endangered different species are. Some of them have disappeared, some of them are very close to disappearing. There are different categories of levels of threat that species has. And here, of course, is where policymakers and decision makers play a critical role. It's not particularly the scientists who provide the information, but it's decision makers who have to define and implement policies. And last but not least, in case none of the 5 previous challenges are enough to convince a human being that it's important to conserve biodiversity, there's the more anthropocentric position that it is indispensable. Our own survival depends on the survival of those species, of those forests, of those agricultural products or wild products that could be domesticated and turned into agricultural products in the future before they disappear. The challenge is then how to use sustainably that biodiversity. The modern understanding of biodiversity conservation says that we should do three things to really conserve biodiversity. First one, understand. We have to understand biodiversity. So the number 2, 3, and 4 are related to that understanding facet of conservation. The other has to do with using biodiversity sustainably. The more we understand biodiversity, the more intelligent decisions we can make about how to use it sustainably, and vice versa. And the third aspect is the traditional one. Of course, we have to save it. But saving biodiversity or that action alone is not enough, particularly in biodiversity-rich countries, which in most cases happen to be also developing countries. Saving is not something that could be done separately from the sustainable use of that biodiversity and the deep understanding of it. So you may be wondering what's the difference between biodiversity informatics and bioinformatics. Bioinformatics came first. It was coined by molecular biologists, and it means a slightly different thing. When I have this picture, I always make sure that it is, first of all, understood that it was not the fault of computer scientists to have bioinformatics, biodiversity informatics, and also eco-informatics. This corresponds to a division that already exists in biology of specialists in genomics and proteomics, or let's say in molecular biology, those who do taxonomy in the middle, and those who are ecologists. So if computer scientists support each of these three, then we end up with three areas: bioinformatics, biodiversity informatics, and eco-informatics. It's, in my opinion, an artificial division that exists because of historical reasons. But this should be biodiversity informatics, or this should be bioinformatics. It's shorter. I like it better. But the bio part shouldn't be understood as molecular biology. It should be understood as life, or biodiversity, or living nature. We are getting closer to this. We could talk a lot about the history of biodiversity informatics at the level of institutions, national level, global level, etc. But today we don't have enough time. I prefer to directly go into the 3 or 4 milestones. In 1990, this is called the year of the Big Bang. Australians, who have very rich biodiversity, but who also have a developed country, are recognized as the pioneers. They had an organization, it was governmental, called Erick, and they started doing basically GIS work, trying to map where biodiversity was and how it was changing over time. Wonderful work that they were doing at Erick and the Ministry of the Environment. In the 1990s, very few countries had a Ministry of the Environment. That's a new thing, relatively. But a couple of years later, there was a big workshop. I shouldn't say big workshop, because only 3, 4 countries were attending. But it was big in terms of the impact that it had. INBio, the National Biodiversity Institute of Costa Rica, CONABIO from Mexico, and then the Alexander von Humboldt Institute from Colombia, 3 developing countries, had this workshop in Australia and decided that we should have institutions like Erick, adapted to our own realities, and therefore INBio was created in Costa Rica, CONABIO in Mexico a couple of years later, and about 3 or 4 years later, the von Humboldt Institute in Colombia. Those first 10 years allowed other countries to follow up on the example set by Australia, Costa Rica, Mexico, and Colombia, and they were developed at different levels in different countries. But very quickly, it became evident that yes, we could do some important work at the national level, but we should also integrate the efforts. And above all, make sure that the information about a country, which is normally held elsewhere, particularly with developing countries, should be integrated in a single database, even if it was a federated database that gave you the impression it was physically localized somewhere, but it was actually a distributed database, as is the case. So GBIF, the Global Biodiversity Information Facility, was established in that decade, and also the Biodiversity Heritage Library, Encyclopedia of Life, Map of Life, and several others at the global level. And now that we have these global level initiatives established, the milestone that is being established, I wouldn't say we are there yet, is to integrate this information at all levels, but also to go up to the level of knowledge management, not just information management. Very quickly, some of the initiatives. GBIF is possibly the best example of how to deal with a myth. The myth that a heterogeneous or a collection of heterogeneous databases that were established in different countries, in different institutions, and then sometimes even at the personal level, my personal database, some of them in Access, some of them in Oracle, some of them in DBase, whatever database management system you can imagine, that could be all integrated into a single database. And of course, the key to this was to establish a standard, a data sharing standard called the Darwin Core, which GBIF pushed very strongly. And now we are in the very interesting situation that in some countries, including Costa Rica, it is easier to get integrated access to the information about Costa Rica from both Costa Rican institutions and international institutions. The Missouri Botanical Garden, for example, holds a lot of information about Costa Rica's plants from Costa Rica. And so does Kew Gardens and New York Botanical Garden and the Smithsonian Institution and so on. It's simpler to go to the GBIF website and ask for the information from Costa Rica, no matter where it is physically held. You can go there and have a national level website if you wish, if you do the right queries. I have here in red a couple of things that have to do simply with the multimedia facet that the GBIF is now getting into, because it's going from specimen level records that say for each of, let's say what the number last night was, 617 million records. Each record is a description of one sample that was collected in some specific place at some specific date, has a specific taxonomic description, scientific name, and some additional information, sometimes pictures, but that's optional. Now they have gathered 11 million images, and the number of audios is about 70,000, mainly of birds. BHL, I already mentioned. It's a group of digital librarians, let me summarize it and oversimplify it, who have looked at papers, books, documents that had no IPR issues, no intellectual property right issues, so they tend to be relatively old, even though they have made agreements with recent journals and recent publications. And this is, in my opinion, the most interesting database for data mining, because it's text. It's just strings of text that are claiming to be marked, so that then we can make more intelligent queries and mine that information and turn it into descriptions that allow us to, for example, more easily determine if two species may have different names but are the same thing, because we can get directly access to attributes of those species. So bring me all the fish that are blue and have a size between 5 centimeters and 10 centimeters. We cannot ask that question today. But if we could, then we would get a relatively small sample of fish with those characteristics, and we can do some revision. That's what taxonomists call it, revision to clean up the mess and make sure that those, 100 different fish that we got are really 100 different fish, not maybe 20 or 30 or 50 that have multiple names. And finally, the initiative that I have been more involved with has been EOL. I was 2.5 years the executive director of this initiative, and this is going one level up. It's taking those specimen level records that have the quote-unquote boring information of what was found, where it was found, when it was found, and turning it into human-readable descriptions of each species. It's an encyclopedia that has one web page for each of the 2 million species that have been so far described. Actually, it has 1.3 million so far. And some of them are very, very, I would say, telegraphic, very short. Some of them are very rich. If you look at the quetzal, for example, a beautiful bird, national bird of Guatemala, it has more than 100 pictures of the quetzal, and they are all openly available under Creative Commons 3.0 licenses, I believe. So it's very, very openly used by teachers, by the general public. This is not aimed at scientists. This is aimed at the general public. All right. So this is where we are. And what are the current challenges at the global level, and how can we help? You know, the Aichi targets were established for the year 2020, among other things, because the targets we had for the year 2010 were not achieved at all. So new targets were established, 20. 5 strategic goals, 20 targets. There are 2 of them that are particularly sensitive to the work that we can do as information and communication technology specialists. The first one has to do with what we in Costa Rica call bioliteracy, education, environmental education. And it says by the year 2020, at the latest, people are aware of the value of biodiversity and the steps they can take to conserve and use it sustainably. Our role there is as facilitators in technology-based education to make sure that this level of awareness increases. And there are some very nice examples. iNaturalist is an initiative that I didn't mention, but it's one that allows any citizen to become a citizen scientist. You can take pictures, you can upload those pictures, you can automatically, because it's probably with a GPS or a mobile phone that you took the picture, that information goes to a place where a number of taxonomists help identify what is it that you uploaded, and therefore you are contributing to perhaps not discovering a new species, but to map better where is it that it lives. And for birds, for example, which many of them are migratory, it is important to have as many records as possible of observations of those birds. Aichi target number 19 has more to do with the generation of knowledge by scientists. And it says, by 2020, knowledge, the science-based, and this is my own emphasis, technologies related to biodiversity, its values, functioning, status, and trends, and the consequences of its loss are improved, widely shared, and transferred and applied. This is where most of the activities that the roadmap to biodiversity informatics, which I will briefly mention now at the end of this presentation, focus. Here we have about 13 challenges, obstacles that have, for the, I would say, for the first 15 years, presented as reasons why there's a lot of difficulty in using information technologies to cope with biodiversity conservation challenges. So depending on whether you are optimistic or pessimistic, you would focus on the obstacles row of this table or on the opportunity rows of this table. I have under opportunity the quick answers. This is not by any means exhaustive, but these are the quick answers to those traditional obstacles that I would like in this presentation that you take as really myths if anybody tries to use them. We have other obstacles now that are like the next step after these obstacles have been surpassed. So some of them are the cultural, technical, scientific, legal, and political. I will very quickly go over them. At the cultural level, computer illiteracy, that was true, but it's not so true, even though we have, of course, a digital gap and many challenges. Nowadays, the answer would be that hypertext, internet, GIS, among other technologies, are widely understood and used. For those of you who are not from Costa Rica, you should know that Waze is widely used here in Costa Rica because of the poor roads and the traffic problems we have. I use it every day to go to work. I know exactly where I work and where I live, but in order to understand what is it that there are traffic problems, I use Waze, and it takes me to some places that I wouldn't take. So GIS awareness and the importance of GIS is something that most citizens have the moment they get, of course, a mobile phone and these free applications. It is for free that you get it. So I have high hopes. I just met a former student of my multimedia class from Panama. I have to say that I no longer teach that class because it's no longer something new. I haven't taught it for the last 8 years, I think. It was very important 9, 10, 20 years ago, but it's surpassed by what our children know now. Second cultural obstacle, lack of awareness. Yes, that's always going to be a challenge, but now we have advanced, and there are very nice citizen science initiatives, not just globally, but at the national level in many of our countries, especially the rich, biodiversity-rich countries, have done that. We've done it here in Costa Rica, but I would suggest that you look at a website called Zooniverse, Z-O-O, I don't think it has a U, Z-O-O-Niverse. If you have a project where you want to do citizen science, you upload the description of your project and you can have people there basically working for you. Of course, your goals have to be non-commercial and related to better supporting the work of scientists. Some people have discovered new planets there because they upload thousands of images of planets from NASA, not of planets, of the space, and they give some basic rules. They become kind of para-astrologists. They give them rules. You know, if you see something that is blue and is half the size of that other red object and so on, then there's a good chance it's a planet. Then just surround it, mark it, and a specialist would look at it, and bingo, sometimes they get new planets. You can do similar things with species. At the technical level, I have more, because this is a more technical crowd. So here I have 5. Heterogeneous databases. In an institution, many scientists still hold personal databases, and they use Excel, or they use Access to maintain those databases. Then the institution has an Oracle database, and then at the national level, there's not even a national database. How can we pretend that they all move to Oracle, which is expensive, very nice, very good, but very expensive, or to Access, which has limitations for a national level database? Well, the answer is down here as data sharing standards in place. The Darwin Core allows you to export on a regular basis, say once a month, once a semester, export your information into that format, and then GBIF has a crawler that every month, every 6 months, whatever you establish, goes there, gets that information, puts it in a single place, and there's how you now have at GBIF more than 600 million records. And that's how some of those Access and Oracle and other databases that you had in your institution became obsolete. It's better to go and just use your browser. Of course, you need to have an internet connection and access the national website that you can get at GBIF. And it's not only national website, you can do it also regionally or by taxonomic groups and so on. So no longer is it true that the heterogeneous nature of information is an obstacle. Expensive hardware and maintenance. Hardware and maintenance are always more expensive than our budgets permit, but the cloud has made it possible for many small organizations, for a small fee, to have excellent hardware and excellent maintenance and services. They don't have to worry about updating the hardware every 3 years because it becomes obsolete or anything like that. I'm not saying that this resolves 100% of the problem. It alleviates it, and in some cases, it really resolves it. Expensive software, yes. Some of us, not me anymore, but some of us develop software, and we should be paid a good price for that. But now you can find free software everywhere. How many applications are there at the Apple Store? If anybody had been asked this question 10 years ago, probably they would say, a few thousand, a few hundred perhaps. It's more than 1 million applications, and most of them are free, or the cost is between $1 or $20. That's amazing. So there's a lot of software available to do lots of work. Even operating systems are becoming free now, which was a no-no for any software company. Devices for field work are expensive and non-portable. There was a time when a GPS was really expensive. And even if you had a GPS for military reasons, I remember, I don't know if it was the case of other developed countries, but the US scrambled the information and you couldn't get the exact location where you were. Now that's a myth. Waze is the example. I wouldn't be able to get to work every day if we had that. And scientists who go to the field, in some cases, not really in very deep forests, like some of the forests we have here in the neotropic, may even have access to internet, and they may be able to do identifications or avoid bringing, tens of books with them because they have access to the best digital libraries now with their mobile device. They have a GPS, and they have excellent cameras. They can take pictures right there to better document their work. Supercomputer power is too expensive. That is still true because the definition of supercomputer is changing. What I would call a supercomputer when I was an undergrad, a computer, Francisco and Gabriela may remember this, a computer with 60K of RAM that was able to take care of registration, payroll, and computer science students like us. Well, any iPhone was a supercomputer, of course, compared to what we had then. No, that is true. It will always be expensive compared to what we have in our hands or in our personal devices. But we really have a lot of data, storage capacity on the cloud or even locally, and we also have a lot of supercomputing power. With 2 GPUs, 2 graphic processing units, you can do wonders in image processing nowadays that you could only get with a Cray 1 computer a few years ago. In addition to that, there are some tasks that are simple enough for crowdsourcing, for people, of course, large amounts of people to do. So this trend towards using the power of many people instead of many CPUs or many computers is also making a big difference. At the scientific level, this is a bit scientific and a bit cultural. It's the scientific culture. Scientific data not accessible. There are incentives for scientists not to publish the information right away. They better get 2 or 3 publications and make sure that those 5 years of work, which involve going to the field, going to Corcovado here, which is very far away, it's our Amazon forest. How come I have been working for 5 years and now I publish my database and some guy comes here and, in 1 month of analyzing my information, writes several seminal papers and might not even give me credit. There's no incentive to publish databases. If you are a faculty member at a university, you will get points if you publish papers with few authors, hopefully, so don't share your information. But if you publish your database, you're being suicidal because you won't be getting any points. You will be giving other people points. That's changing. Some universities are making this, this activity of making a database available, something that gives you points. And in fact, there's something interesting now called data papers. You publish a paper that probably has very few text. It's almost like metadata, and along with that comes with the database. That's very useful for other scientists, and that gives you as many points as a traditional publication. So a response to that, as a response to that, we have the open science movement, which is like an extreme position, but this is also supported by several governments. More and more governments, including the government of the US, is saying, if you got federal funds to do your research, then we'll give you a moratorium, a 1-year moratorium perhaps, for you to publish and make sure you claim your place here. But then that information, the whole database, should be made available. Taxpayers already paid for that. They shouldn't pay twice by subscribing to a magazine or anything like that. Number 2, slow publication workflow. It used to take 2-3 years in a good journal to have your publication published. Now we have digital publications which didn't start well in the sense that people didn't get proper credit for publishing there, but now there are very good digital journals that gives the researcher as many points as some analogic publications. And the global taxonomic impediment, I didn't mention it before. It is part of the reality. It has to do with taxonomists and how taxonomists have become an endangered species. It's kind of ironic, but there are fewer and fewer taxonomists every day. In some cases, they don't have a next generation of specialists that they trained. And we have seen that here in Costa Rica sometimes. We have an estimated number of 12,000 species of plants and hundreds of thousands of insects. And the specialist is a venerable Finnish scientist who is 90 years old now, and we are sure that in 10 years we are not going to have a specialist to do that work. Well, molecular taxonomy is one answer to that, not as a substitute for traditional morphology-based taxonomy, but as a complement. If you have the DNA of an organism and you have a database that holds the DNA of all known organisms, then it should be clear that one can easily identify what organism you have in your hands. That's still an expensive, relatively expensive process. The idea is, as Dan Jansen puts it, that with a device of this size, you can go to the field and take a piece of a leaf, for example, put it in there, and then identify what it is based on the DNA. We are still at the mainframe level. This has to be sent to Guelph University or to the Smithsonian or to a few places in the world where they use the quote-unquote mainframe to process that. But with the current trends, at some point we should have an iPhone-sized device to do that. And also the subject of my interest today, or these days, which is automated organismal identification based on images. Give me an image of a flower, and I will tell you with a certain level of certainty what is the ranking, what are the top 10 plants that qualify as probably the species associated with that flower. And if you can give me a leaf and you can give me some geospatial information, then I may give you the top 3 or the top 4 and have a good chance of identifying it. Technology, at the legal level, technology changes faster than laws and intellectual property rights. Those will always be a challenge. But now we have Creative Commons licenses, and most of the scientific institutions are adhering to Creative Commons licenses. Therefore, I'm very hopeful. I have already seen how this has changed. Very few lawyers are involved in these negotiations. That's a good start. Because it's a standard way of describing how is it that I'm willing to share my information. No second or ulterior interpretations. It's exactly a Creative Commons license 2.0 or 3.0 or 1.0 that I'm using, so don't worry, don't involve your lawyer. It should be unambiguous. What is it that I mean by that? And finally, at the political level, governments don't have a green agenda. We complain that in national elections, certain negative issues become the big issues and nothing about the conservation of biodiversity, no green agendas. Well, that is changing. Naively, I would say, because most countries have signed the biodiversity, the CBD, what is translated in the Biodiversity Conservation, agreement, and several CITES, and there are at least 4 international conventions that deal with biodiversity conservation. But one thing is signing, and another thing is really following your commitments. But at least it is on the table, and now with the HE targets, in this case, number 1 and number 19 that I mentioned, we are pressured. And some countries, like Costa Rica, have said very serious things, like that we will become neutral, carbon neutral by the year 2020, and so on. I have 1 more minute. But I have covered the key points. These are the focus areas, these are the focus areas that were defined for this roadmap to biodiversity informatics. We have already talked about most of them, but it's good to know that somebody else took the time, and many taxonomists were involved here. That's why we have this taxonomy. Cultural, data level, evidence level, and understanding. This should be a pyramid. What we identified in a workshop about 4 years ago was, what are those areas where biodiversity informatics researchers could contribute more? Let's start with culture. At the bottom of the pyramid is the cultural activity. We have to make sure that we have open access and a culture of reuse, data standards, persistent storage and archival, policy incentives, and a biodiversity knowledge network, that is specialists who are available. We already talked about this. This is at the cultural level. Then the next level is the data level. And we have to make sure that all materials are published. Collections and specimens in herbaria and natural history museums are also available. Genomic information, meteorologic information, and so on. At the evidence level, which is the synthesis of primary data, so it's moving from data towards knowledge and evidence, we have to make sure we have the right taxonomic framework. I am very sad to inform you that right now we don't have one single taxonomy for our biodiversity. And we don't have 2, and we don't have 5. I know Liliana sitting there probably knows the right number, but it's in the 10s or in the 100s. Because scientists don't agree on my last discovery. Where should it go? What genus does it belong to? And I write a paper on why it should go here, and then Gabriela writes another paper saying, no, it shouldn't go there, it should go somewhere else. And I will stick with my taxonomy, and you stick with your taxonomy. That's how it works. Ego and other issues are involved. Genetic or molecular taxonomy should help in solving those problems. And there are others, but then at the understanding level, there's the more global information level. One of them that I'm very involved with is now prioritizing new data capture. because I think we are wasting the opportunity now that we have all these devices to go to the field and capture images, videos, audios, and help. We don't have time to go over this. This is the pyramid: culture, data, evidence, understanding, and the dashes at the bottom of each of these icons suggests how far we are into getting to solving those challenges. So we are relatively good with respect to culture and data, and not so good with respect to evidence and understanding, which is a reflection of how this has evolved, because the main challenges had to do with gathering the primary data necessary to build the rest of the pyramid. So very quickly, conclusions in the last 10 seconds. Biodiversity informatics has achieved important goals at the culture and data level, according to that previous slide. The first 15 years were dominated by developing databases, quality control, data sharing standards. But now new technical, scientific, legal, cultural, and political developments have turned traditional obstacles into opportunities that we should take. And this is my own take on why, and this is a personal challenge I have had for many years. I told you I have been involved with this for about 20 years. For the first 10 years, I was always the weird guy in the meetings because I was a computer scientist. It was mainly biologists who were trying to get into the digital world and do this stuff, and they were doing very good work. But it was, every time I tried to get computer scientists involved, I have to say I failed. Because they said, well, this is a database application. I cannot send a paper to a computer science journal. Maybe I could send a interdisciplinary joint paper written with biologists to a biology paper, journal, sorry. That is changing, because now there's some very interesting stuff, for example, with respect to machine learning and computer vision, among other things, that have been attracting computer scientists. Last week I was in a meeting of computer scientists in Portugal, who were basically showing how is it that they were identifying organisms via videos, images, and sounds. That's specific. And the weird guy in the room was a biologist who was there helping us. That's an interesting thing. And these are examples of some projects I'm personally involved, but this is just to let you know that I'm heavily into this, and I still believe we're enjoying a wonderful time to demonstrate that we as computer scientists can make a difference. Thank you very much.